Matthew, thank you. What I thought I'd do is really describe what it was like after I'd decided to reread these three very, very famous books for the first time in literally 50 years. I'd referred to them from time to time since I first encountered them as a student, but I hadn't read them from beginning to end, let alone in sequence, until, as I say, half a century after I first found them on the reading lists, where, of course, they always have been and look like remaining. Now, I assume you all have some idea. For all I know, there are somewhere in this room people who know as much as I do about one or more of these famous texts. But I assume you all know something about them and you have some idea why they are as famous as they are. But of course there are very many reasons for which they are famous. In each case they cover a very wide range of topics: philosophical, sociological, political, or however you choose to classify them. But it seemed to me that when I reread them, that they really share, all three of them, a single overriding central concern. And although of course they were writing about totally different worlds, I mean the world of ancient Greece is very, very different from the world of Hobbes's Britain, and Hobbes's world is very, very different from the world in which Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And one of the people at whom I have a slight sideswipe in the book, actually, if you want to see, is, although he's a justly famous philosopher, is Collingwood, who specifically said that one of the things that really people ought not to do if they're academically reputable and serious is to compare across the centuries what people say about societies of such totally different kinds as Plato's Athens and Hobbes's England. Well, I think that's exactly what is worth doing, and it's what to some extent I'm trying to do in the book. But what they're really concerned about is they are all three equally dismayed, not to say appalled, by the seemingly total inability of human beings to live with each other in an orderly and harmonious manner. Now, there are three solutions, very broadly, and again, I expect I'm telling you what you probably all do have some fair idea about. I mean, they address the question of, well, who should hold the power in order that we can all live together in order and harmony? And Plato famously said, well, we want to, of course, give the power to the philosopher kings, give the power to people who know how to make societies function in an orderly and harmonious manner, and they will then educate everybody else to do what they should to keep it that way. Hobbes said, what you have to do is you have to give supreme authority to a single sovereign. Doesn't have to be a single person. I mean, Hobbes is quite clear about that, although he, I think, preferred monarchy. But he simply says you've got to have a single overriding authority. And that person has got to be acknowledged to have the right to keep all the rest of us in order. Otherwise, we will never achieve peace and harmony that we would all like to have. And then Marx finally says, well, the way to do that, it's perfectly clear that all societies are divided up to now between the oppressed and the oppressors. So take the power away from the oppressors and give it to the oppressed. Put the people who've been oppressed on top, and they'll see to it that this kind of thing isn't allowed to happen again. Expropriate the expropriators and so on. Now, they are all three, and I found this as I rereading, they are very compelling. I mean, you can put them in a way in which it's almost impossible to dissent from what at least they're saying that they're trying to do. Because Plato says, look, wouldn't it be better if we were ruled by wise and good rulers and they could make everybody else wise and good too? Well, who's going to quarrel with that? Hobbes says, look, do you really want to go back to the war of all against all, don't you recognize that the way we can all live in peace and order is if we all agree that it's as if we had communally signed up to a contract in which we hand over power to a sovereign in return for the sovereign guaranteeing the protecting us against each other, not least, and also against the other people out there who are going to come and make war on us and take our possessions away and threaten our lives and so on. And Marx, equally, it's very persuasive. You say, look, just dismantle this whole apparatus of expropriation, exploitation, and oppression. Simply remove the people who are doing the oppressing, and then we will have the kind of world in which we would all be happy to live, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, and so on. And it's not as if any of them could be accused of being naive about human nature. The one thing they are not is sort of milk and water liberals saying, let's all be nicer to each other. They have no illusions about how difficult it is to get people to behave, never mind nicely, to behave even halfway decently to one another. And Plato is absolutely firm that you can't do it unless everybody knows their place and sticks to it. Hobbes is absolutely clear that you've got to submit to what your government tells you to do in return for the protection. Not that the government can tell you to do absolutely anything. The government mustn't violate the law of nature. You can't have a mad tyrant who says, I want everybody to kill themselves by 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. That is a violation of the law of nature, and you are not required to obey a command like that. But you are basically required to do anything that the sovereign tells you, and everybody else is too. And if you don't all obey, well, then watch out, because we'll get back to the anarchy and disorder, which of course is what he was so appalled by in his own lifetime. And equally, Marx, famously, no milk and water liberalism there either. You have to dismantle the whole hateful apparatus of the bourgeois state and everything that goes with it. But what I found on my rereading, and I was doing this after 50 years of myself trying to meditate not about how to construct the good society, I don't have a recipe, I'm afraid, but trying to understand in a historical and comparative way how human societies of different kinds come to be the way they are. I found all three of their solutions quite extraordinarily sociologically naive. And I want to stress that, not psychologically. They were very shrewd, all three of them, about human motives and behavior. But in terms of an institutional design which would even begin to have a chance of creating the brave new world that they're trying to persuade their readers that they have the answer to. Now, in saying that, let me put in two reservations. I think I've already made clear that I don't think that sociology, whatever you mean by that, or sociologists have the answer to this question. But on the other hand, we do know far more about how human societies function and evolve than, never mind Plato or Hobbes, than 100 years ago. I do want to claim that much for my subject, that there is actually a stock of knowledge about human institutions, communities, cultures, and societies, which there wasn't. So that although, of course, I'm not pretending that anybody can come along now and correct Marx's or Hobbes's or Plato's sociology in the way that they can be put right in their mistakes about biology or physics, I do think that we collectively are in a position to appraise their arguments with a lot more than simple prejudice or distaste. And having said that, I did find quite a lot of distaste as I reread these books. I mean, Plato, you probably know, some of you may have read Karl Popper's devastating attack on Plato as a totalitarian. And I'd forgotten until I reread it. I mean, it really is awful. The eugenics is weird, to put it mildly. He has a little passage I refer to in the book about of course, and one of the things we're very good about is letting people die. And I thought, oh, euthanasia, yes, that's a live topic. What does he mean? He means that you don't get medical help if you're dying. It means that doctors should not be allowed to attend you when you're on your way out. And he also has the strange idea where the philosophers who go to town on this, I mean, Bernard Williams in particular has a brilliant article about this, in which he really faults Plato for having it both ways. Because Plato wants to say that, of course, a good society is a society full of good people. Well, and he's going to make, the Guardian's going to make everybody good, and then you'll have a good society. But hang on, you can say a brave society is a society of brave people, a rich society is a society of rich people, but he makes the actual mistake in which he says, and of course one thing we don't want is tyranny, because we don't want a tyrannical society full of tyrannical people. But hang on, the problem with a tyrannical society is that you have a tyrant and the tyrant's henchmen, and a lot of other people who hate tyranny and aren't tyrannical at all. The whole problem is that the tyrant is one sort of person and the ruled are the other. So that as well as the unreality of his expectations about how institutions could be organised, there runs through the Republic this deep-seated flaw, which, as I say, I claim no credit, but in the secondary literature, Bernard Williams, I think, has the best single article about this. And you see then, Hobbes simply doesn't realise not only that you don't have to have a sovereign. I refer in the book, and I claim credit to the fact that I put in the reference before she got the Nobel Prize last year, to the work of Elinor Ostrom, one of whose articles is actually called Covenants Without the Sword. I mean, the reference to Hobbes is perfectly clear. There are lots of well-documented cases in the historical and sociological record where people can arrive at agreements, cooperative agreements, without there having to be an external sanction of force. And Hobbes simply doesn't realise that if you give all this power to the sovereign, you're only going to make it more likely that people will rebel because they resent the degree of power you're given. And conversely, if the sovereign is prepared to allow some intermediate institutions, if a sovereign is allows the possibility of a loyal opposition, in quotes, this is actually a much better bet for preserving reasonable harmony and order than every time anybody steps out of line, being told that disobedience in any form is threatening to bring the whole house of cards down. It obviously isn't. And Marx, the trouble, again, nothing original in this, but I was struck rereading, particularly in sequence, the three famous books, at the naivety of thinking that once the oppressed have done away with the oppressors, have simply got them out of the way, that the problem which gave rise to people oppressing each other isn't going to occur again. There's absolutely nothing in the Communist Manifesto, and a lot of people would say nor anywhere else in the whole corpus of Marxist writing, which is really persuasive about why the post-bourgeois capitalist society is going to eliminate the conflict between even everybody's proletarians, but can't proletarians exploit each other? Won't they have conflicts of interest? Won't they come to blows? And yet it simply isn't tackled at all. So why should we be so impressed by these three great authors who get it sociologically so completely and unrealistically wrong? And I think the answer is, at the end of the book, I coin a phrase which, as far as I know, is original to myself, but that's a risky thing to do at the best of times. But for myself saying, to the extent that these are works of sociology, I mean, they're also works of other things, but they are talking about and making how human institutions work and why they break down and so forth. See, they're not really predicting. I mean, Marx was predicting, because he said it's all going to happen. But the arguments in these books aren't saying this is exactly what is inevitably going to happen and why, and nor is it just saying, I'm going to tell you all how you ought to behave. If you want a good society, these are the things you must do. Of course, you can read that into it. The phrase I coined was, I think that these are masterpieces of what I call optative sociology. In other words, what they're saying and why the message is so powerful, they look at the world around them, they think, isn't this appalling? Can't we do better? And they say to themselves, and therefore to us, if only certain sorts of things could be changed, how much better a world it would be. And these are the sorts of things which somehow or other we're going to have to find a way of doing. We're going to have to educate people better in a Platonic society so that they see that it's to their interest to behave better. So you've got to discipline people. We cannot have seditious clerics and turbulent, unruly citizens making trouble. They have got to be brought to recognize that you can't go on that way. And Marx, of course, the bourgeoisie and the enlightened bourgeoisie, in his view, recognize it themselves. They've got to see that if you've just got to stop being the way you, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist oppressing class, are, that's the only way. And after that, surely we can get things better. And those arguments I did find extraordinarily powerful, partly because of the gifts, the intellectual and literary gifts of these three great thinkers. I found that they still had this extraordinary impact, which is what keeps them alive, even though, as a sociologist, with all the reservations that sociologists don't know much more than anybody else about human societies, but they do know a bit, despite my concluding that the sociological arguments which they put forward for their brave new world are quite extraordinarily bad.
Can I start? I'm a great fan of the films of Alfred Hitchcock, but I'm all too willing to agree that he also made a couple of terrible films. Does the fact that he made some terrible films in any way undermine the value of his great films? Or to apply it to your work, does the fact that these brilliant philosophers made some mistakes with their sociological analysis take away from the many insights in their book? Does it undermine the quality of their good arguments?
Well, of course, there are two ways of answering that question. One is to say they wrote other books. I mean, I have just been talking about these three, their most famous books, the books that I had to read as a student, because there they were on the reading list, and there they still are. And they all wrote other things, and some people in their defense might say, and I would agree, well, there's more to it than that. Look at what Plato wrote about Socrates, the death of Socrates. Look at what Hobbes wrote about civil war, about religion, which he talks a certain amount about, of course. And Marx wrote a lot of other things, and some would say, and he made the case for his theory of history more powerfully in some of the later works. But I don't think you can say everybody has an off day, when the off day is the day on which you're trying to put together your absolutely, how shall I put it? It's not looking for your number one hit, but this is where you want to have the most impact. Do you see that? I think there are two ways of answering that question, but I take your point, absolutely. And I'm not pretending that they can't, these three great men didn't say some other things about which my strictures wouldn't apply at all.
I'm occasionally on a program called The Moral Maze, which I think is created purely in order to irritate people and does the job extremely well. Last night we were discussing teenage pregnancy, and we had a sociologist on, who, much to the delight of the moralists on the panel, Melanie Phillips included, when she was asked the question as a sociologist, yes, but what do you think a good family should be? She said she refused to answer this question. She As a sociologist, I don't have a view on what a good family should be. I'm merely describing the conditions which give rise to certain social outcomes. It's not for me to hypothesize on goodness and badness. So is there a kind of unbridgeable difference between the concerns of sociologists and the concerns of philosophers? And is it fair to criticize philosophers for not being good sociologists? After all, there are many sociologists who aren't good philosophers.
To take up your first point first, I very strongly agree with the unnamed lady who gave that answer, because too much of what goes under the name of sociology is, and none the worse for that, I mean, it can be well or badly done like anything else, but is personal ruminations by the author, reflections on the state of the modern world, the human condition, and so forth, and sometimes very explicitly intended to persuade the reader of their views about what's good and bad. But it's no good pretending that sociologists can speak as, quote, scientists. You can't talk about human behavior in the same way that you can talk about atoms and molecules and all that business. And there's no good pretending that you have. So that what you have to do is recognize that part of the interest of trying to understand human social institutions is a bit like you could perhaps say in medicine. I mean, the notion of pathology can be given a perfectly hard scientific sense on which people from left and right they can all agree. All you have to agree is that disease is a bad thing, and you would like to cure people of what everybody recognizes are diseases. And in that sense, trying to improve the state of the society is a model. But the minute you let yourself, as a sociologist, and it's very tempting, the minute you let your own moral and political views intrude as such, you're simply going to undermine your own credibility. Because if I can read the works of a fellow sociologist and say, well, we've seen all that kind of left-wing stuff before. We know where he or she is coming from. And equally, I'll give some specific examples, but deliberately, of historians whose work has, I think, immensely enlarged our understanding of aspects of the history of this country, but both of whom are so prejudiced and blatantly political prejudiced that it seems to me they simply shoot themselves in the foot. And the first is Edward Thompson, with a wonderful book, The Making of the English Working Class. But it's a polemical tract. It's an anti-capitalist, moralistic, William Morrissey, romantic tract. Corelli Barnett, The Audit of War, the famous peroration about the New Jerusalem of Labour after 1945, as if this was a historical statement. So it ends up, what do we end up with? The New Jerusalem. I can't quote it from memory. Maybe you can. It's a famously ghastly paragraph for which to end what passes for a work of serious scholarship about a sort of degraded proletariat hanging on the nipple of the welfare state or something. Well, okay, if that's what you think, you're entitled to think it. And if you want to stand for Parliament and argue it, get on the hustings and argue it. But if you're writing an academic book, then will you effing well keep it to yourself? I think everybody writing academically, and historians, anthropologists have the same problem, sociologists, you really have to be careful because, of course, we all do have moral and political prejudices. And you just got to keep them out of there. Now, in the case of to come to the second part of your question, Matthew, no, of course, these people, they were, in our terms, I think terms that they would recognize, that they were doing philosophy. They were saying, what would a good society look like? They regard that as something on which you can have academic expertise. You can speak with authority, as they claim to do, because of what they knew, thought, and understood. You present evidence and so forth. But they, of course, the distinction I've been drawing would be completely irrelevant to all those three, because what they were doing was, quite rightly, doing both. Saying, I want to persuade you of my idea of the good society, and I want to give you some evidence, look at the awful world around you, of why I think you should sign up to my version of what we ought to do. So in their case, that distinction dissolves, but it doesn't make me any more comfortable if I find myself, when I write about the present day world, sneaking in a few little prejudices that I know I've got, like we all have.
So can I ask you finally, before opening it up, Gary, let's just imagine this book, I'm sure it will, it does extremely well, and you get a phone call from Princeton saying we've read, we've seen the great response to the book. What was your word? Optative?
Optative, yeah.
And they say, but we've had an overwhelming request for you yourself to take up the mantle and for you to write a book, your own vision of the circumstances which might resolve this fundamental question of how it is we can maintain order. Is this a brief that you would take up, or would you think that the very idea was a folly?
No. The reason I wouldn't take it up is because, right back to what I was saying, sociology, however far it's advanced in the last 100 years, because we just know more about human societies of different kinds, we are miles away from having the sort of answers to how it really works that biologists are beginning to have at the moment and physicists have. So that to presume to an expertise which nobody has would be frankly fraudulent. And on a lot of practical questions of the kind which occasionally and in public discussion, people sometimes say, well, what does sociologists have to say about that? And I found occasions on which I've answered questions a bit similar to that, saying, God's sake, don't go anywhere near the sociology shelves in the university library. Read the Financial Times. Because for a lot of the practical day-to-day problems, which it would be nice to think, you ring up your of course, economics is the bubble over my head now. You ring up your friendly neighborhood Nobel Prize-winning economist and say, how do we get out of this mess? And if you ring one Nobel Prize-winning economist, he'll give you a completely different answer from the other one, which is enough to tell you that is not the kind of expertise. Whereas if you ring up, if you ring up to find out about the workings of how proteins are transmitted genetically by strings of DNA, you're not going to get different answers whether you ring up Crick and Watson or somebody else who's got a Nobel Prize on the other side of the world in the same sort of area. We're all, as citizens, whatever word you like, we're all as free as each other. And we do to try and persuade each other of our moral and political views about how things ought to be organized. But maybe in another 100, 200 years, sociology will be a real science, and I'm prepared to use that word, but it isn't now.